before the world learned to fear demons, before prophecy spoke of beasts and trumpets, and before humanity imagined hell as a distant place of fire, Scripture quietly preserved a far more unsettling truth. Some angels were not destroyed. They were imprisoned, not cast into myth, not erased from existence, but bound, hidden beneath the architecture of creation itself. These were not ordinary rebels. They were watchers, celestial beings who abandoned their appointed order, crossed forbidden boundaries, and corrupted the earth so completely that God responded with chains instead of mercy. This story is not speculation. It is stitched together from ancient texts, biblical warnings, forgotten scrolls, and the fearful language of demons who knew the prison was real long before humans questioned it. From the days before the flood to the words of Jesus, from apostolic letters to apocalyptic visions, the same pattern emerges again and again. Rebellion restrained, darkness contained, judgment delayed but never cancelled. Beneath the surface of human history lies a sealed reality, a hidden geography where ancient offenders wait in silence for a day already marked on heaven's calendar. What you are about to enter is not a legend of fallen angels roaming freely, but a far more dangerous idea. The possibility that the worst corruption in history was not destroyed, only locked away. That the world you know exists because certain doors remain shut, and that the end of the age may not introduce new horrors, but release old ones, not by accident, but by divine decree. This is the story of the Watcher's prison, why it exists, who guards it, and what happens when restraint gives way to final judgment.
Before the world learned the language of empires, before kings measured greatness by borders and slaughter, there was a different kind of boundary, one that could not be crossed without tearing reality. It wasn't a wall of stone, it wasn't a gate of iron, it was law itself, the invisible architecture that held heaven above earth, spirit above flesh, and the holy order of God above the hungry chaos of desire. In the oldest traditions, the rebellion of the Watchers begins not with a war in the skies, but with a gaze. They looked down. They saw the daughters of men, and a decision formed inside them like a sickness, slow at first, then uncontrollable, then absolute. The ancient account says they took wives for themselves and broke the boundary on purpose, swearing an oath together so none would turn back once the fall began. 1 Enoch 6-7. And when they descended, they did not come like wandering shadows. They came with knowledge, with authority, with the presence of the uncreated realm still clinging to them like frost. They arrived at the mountains, Hermon in the Enochic memory, and the earth received them the way dry ground receives oil. It drinks it, it darkens, and it cannot be cleaned again. They taught humanity things that were not meant for mouths, things that did not mature slowly within wisdom, but arrived fully weaponized: sorcery, root-cutting, enchantments, the reading of stars like a map of fate, the crafting of weapons, the seduction of minds through cosmetics and spells. 1 Enoch 8. Civilization accelerated, but it was not growth. It was infection. A race that had been fragile and mortal suddenly carried forbidden tools, and the soul of man began to believe it could replace God. This is where the story turns brutal, because the sin was not only spiritual and not only sexual, it was structural, an attempt to rewrite creation. The offspring of that union were not ordinary children. They were Nephilim, giants, beings described as violent devourers who consumed the labor of men, then consumed men themselves. 1 Enoch 7, compare Genesis 6:1-4. Their existence was a living contradiction, heaven-born power fused to earth-born appetites, and wherever they walked, order collapsed, the land filled with blood, the sky felt closed, the conscience of humanity grew numb the way skin grows numb under constant pressure. Even if the exact shape of the giants is debated across traditions, the core idea remains consistent. Something happened that was unnatural, and then it produced a world that could no longer be healed by ordinary repentance. So judgment began. Yet it began in a way most people miss. First, heaven moved to restrain the watchers themselves. The oldest texts describe archangels reporting the corruption to the Most High, the violence, the defilement, the forbidden teaching, the unnatural births. 1 Enoch 9. And the response is not immediate apocalypse, but legal action. Commands, decrees, a sentence with specific terms. The watchers are not merely scattered, they are bound. Chains appear in the language of the traditions like a cold refrain, binding, darkness, deep places, imprisonment until the final judgment. 1 Enoch 10, Jude 6, 2 Peter 2:4. This is where your story becomes a prison narrative, not a battlefield narrative. God's response to cosmic rebellion is not only to wipe the surface, it is to lock the culprits away, to remove their influence from the living world, to keep their presence from continually poisoning humanity. And yet the question that ignites this mystery is simple. Where are they held? The New Testament gives clues without giving coordinates. Jude speaks of angels who did not keep their own position, but are kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until judgment. Jude 6. Peter echoes the same theme and uses a term that sounds like a location as much as a condition. Tartarus, the deepest imprisonment. 2 Peter 2:4. The ancient scroll traditions deepen the imagery. A pit, a desert place, a cleft of the earth, a valley of judgment, darkness like a substance, not merely absence of light. 1 Enoch 10. Biensortsi or Tida. And the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve fragments of the Book of Giants that expand the terror. The giants dream of their doom. They sense the net tightening. They know the watchers will not escape the sentence. Book of Giants, DSS fragments. The prison is not merely punishment, it is containment. But there is something else, something more frightening, woven into the fabric of these accounts. The watchers are not the only beings involved in the corruption. The spirits of the giants, after their destruction, are described as roaming evil spirits that oppress, deceive, and corrupt mankind until the end. 1 Enoch 15-16. That detail matters because it creates two layers of darkness, the watchers bound and their aftermath still loose, which means God's restraint is precise. Certain beings are imprisoned so they cannot continue to teach or breed corruption in the same way, while lesser spirits continue to harass humanity as a reminder that sin echoes. In other words, the prison is not about fear alone. It is about the preservation of history's timeline, keeping certain powers from interfering too much before the appointed end. Now, imagine what that means for the world of Noah. While men build cities and invent violence, heaven is already building chains. While humanity celebrates knowledge, God is preparing confinement. The surface of the earth becomes a stage of increasing depravity, but underground, beneath the visible story, another story is unfolding. Archangels executing judgment like cosmic wardens, binding celestial criminals in a place designed to hold what should never walk free again. And the flood, when it comes, is not simply water. It is cleansing, an undoing, a reset of the surface so the corrupted hybrid line cannot continue. Genesis 6-9. Yet even the flood does not erase the prison remains, locked, hidden, waiting. And this is the seed of the end-time dread. If God bound them, the binding had a purpose. If he locked them away, the lock was necessary, which means release, if it ever comes, would not be random, it would be timed, legal, apocalyptic. That's why the language across scriptures and ancient writings keeps pointing forward. Until the judgment, until the great day, kept for punishment, reserved, the day of doom. Jude 6, 2 Peter 2:4, 1 Enoch 10. The prison is not only a past event, it is a countdown mechanism. So in your story, the earth is not merely a planet, it is a layered battlefield, surface, sky, and underworld. People look up and fear the heavens, but the oldest warnings tell us to look down. Because beneath kingdoms, beneath rivers, beneath deserts, there are places that have been sealed since the first cosmic violation. And the terrifying possibility is not that demons roam. Humanity has always feared that. The terrifying possibility is that certain angels do not roam at all, because God himself decided that if they remained free, mankind would not survive the timeline. Their prison is mercy, not weakness, a restraint placed upon darkness so history could reach the moment when Christ would enter it. And that's where the Gospels cast their shadow over this whole mystery. Because when Jesus arrives, he speaks and acts as if the unseen realm already knows him and fears him. Spirits recognize authority instantly. They beg not to be tormented before the appointed time, Matthew 8:29. They plead not to be sent into the abyss, Luke 8:31. Those are prison words, legal words, timeline words. Christ doesn't argue with them about whether such a place exists. He treats it as real, as established, as dreaded. Which means the prison tradition is not a fantasy in the background of Scripture. It is part of the cosmic structure that the New Testament assumes. And now the story is set. Ancient angels broke the boundary, and heaven responded with chains. The Watcher's prison exists somewhere within the architecture of creation. It is sealed for a reason. And if the end times truly involve loosening what was once restrained, then the most terrifying headline in human history will not be about armies on the surface. It will be about locks beneath the surface beginning to fail. The prison of the Watchers is described like a place that does not belong to human geography, and yet it is repeatedly spoken of as if it touches the earth like a wound beneath the skin. The language is always half location, half condition. Pits, depths, gloom, darkness, clefts, valleys, deserts, abyssal chambers. It is not merely hell as a vague idea. It is custody, detention, containment. In the Enochic tradition, the sentence is specific. Certain watchers are bound in the valleys of the earth until the day of their judgment, while the leader figures are singled out for harsher confinement, 1 Enoch 10. In Jude and Peter, the focus is less on scenery and more on status. They are held under darkness, reserved, kept, imprisoned until the great day, Jude 6, 2 Peter 2:4. On different angles, same reality. Something is locked away. What would a prison for angels even mean? Not iron bars and stone doors. Angels are not trapped by human architecture. Their bondage has to be metaphysical. Chains that bind authority, restrict movement across realms, confine their presence to a designated domain. That's why ancient writings describe the binding like a divine decree, not a human strategy. A sentence spoken in the courtroom of the Most High becomes a cage. Darkness becomes a substance. The abyss becomes an address. This is not fantasy. It's theological logic. If these beings violated order, their punishment would be the stripping of their freedom to move, teach, appear, and corrupt openly. They become prisoners of God's timeline. And the strangest detail across traditions is that this prison is not only punitive, it is strategic. Because the world after the flood still contains evil, still contains rebellion, still contains spiritual conflict. Yet something about the Watchers' influence was so catastrophic that God chose permanent restraint. Their sin was not just personal, it was civilizational. They did not merely tempt, they rewired. That's why the texts repeatedly connect them to forbidden knowledge and corruption of the earth, 1 Enoch 8-9. So the prison becomes a firewall. God contains a particular category of transgression, so humanity can continue through history long enough for redemption to unfold. That makes the Gospels even more chilling. When Jesus encounters unclean spirits, the conversation is never casual. It is legal, urgent, desperate. Have you come to torment us before the time? Matthew 8:29. That line matters because it implies a schedule, a judgment date, a sentencing procedure that even demons recognize. And in Luke, the spirits beg Jesus not to command them into the abyss, Luke 8:31. That is prison language again. A place feared even by the beings that haunt humanity. If the abyss is feared by demons, imagine what it means for angels who are already bound there. It suggests a hierarchy of confinement. Some roam, some are restrained, and some are sealed in a depth so final that even spirits dread it. In Revelation, the theme becomes unavoidable. An angel descends with a key and a chain to bind a dragon for 1,000 years in the abyss, sealing it, Revelation 21-3. Whether one reads this literally, symbolically, or both, The imagery is consistent with the prison tradition: keys, chains, confinement, sealing, timed release. Revelation's world is not chaotic, it is governed. Even judgment follows procedure. The end times are not a breakdown of divine control, they are the unveiling of divine control. And that makes the Watcher's prison feel less like an ancient myth and more like an early chapter in the same judicial system that Revelation later displays. So where is this prison? The Bible is restrained about geography, but the ancient scroll world isn't shy about imagery. Enoch describes places of deep darkness, valleys where imprisoned beings await, and sections of the underworld set apart for judgment, 1 Enoch 18-22. The Book of Giants from the Dead Sea Scrolls presents the giants as receiving dream warnings of coming destruction, with the Watchers implicated in doom that cannot be escaped. Book of Giants, DSS. Jubilees reinforces the theme of rebellious spirits and the devastation that follows their influence, framing the corruption as a world-level contamination that must be contained, Jubilees 5-10. Each text circles the same truth. There are regions of confinement woven into creation. In your story, that's where you lean into the dread. The prison is not a fairy tale cave. It is a cosmic facility, a sector of the unseen realm anchored to the earth. It might be beneath deserts, beneath mountains, beneath places where the surface looks ordinary but the air feels heavy. Not because rocks are cursed, but because history has weight. The world remembers. Certain places hold echoes of ancient violence the way charred wood holds smoke. And the ancient tradition dares the reader to imagine that the Watchers are not gone, not erased, not annihilated, only restrained. They still exist. They still hate. They still remember the moment they were bound. And they still wait. The waiting itself is punishment. For beings who once moved freely between realms, confinement would be torment. Not physical pain, though darkness may be described like a crushing substance, but humiliation. Silence, inactivity, knowledge without agency, rage without outlet. The Watchers were teachers, corruptors, architects of forbidden civilization. Imagine them trapped with nothing but memory of what they did, awareness of what they lost, and the knowledge that their judgment is not avoided, only delayed. That kind of imprisonment becomes a furnace of hatred, a place where rebellion ferments, a place where bitterness concentrates, and the timeline keeps tightening. Scripture links angelic rebellion, flood judgment, and end-time release themes with a thread that never snaps. Jude explicitly places the imprisonment of rebellious angels alongside the flood and the destruction of Sodom as examples of judgment, Jude 6-7. Peter does the same sequence: angels punished, ancient world flooded, cities judged, 2 Peter 2:4-6. That literary structure matters. It suggests continuity. God judged the Watchers, God judged the world, God judged cities, and God will judge again. The past is a blueprint. The prison is part of that blueprint. Now bring the focus back to the earth's surface. After the flood, humanity rebuilds. Nations rise, idols multiply, violence returns. People forget the ancient terror, but the unseen realm does not forget. The prison remains sealed while spirits still roam, still whisper, still seduce. And then a new kind of shock enters history. The Son of God arrives in flesh. The kingdom of heaven touches dirt. And the unseen realm reacts like a courtroom. When the judge enters, spirits scream, authority shifts, the timeline accelerates. Because Christ's arrival means the end is no longer abstract. It is guaranteed. The prison system will not stay closed forever. Judgment will not stay postponed forever. That's why, in an end-time narrative, tremors are not only geological, they are judicial. A sealed door can remain shut for ages, but when the legal hour comes, the key turns. Revelation frames this with terrifying clarity. Angels are bound at rivers, keys open pits, thrones issue sentences, and the earth endures the consequences. Revelation 9. Revelation 16. Revelation 20. The Watcher's prison fits into that same world. It is not the whole apocalypse, but it is one of the oldest locks in creation. And here is the fear that will make your viewers lean closer. What if some of the end-time chaos is not new evil, but old evil returning? Not newly invented darkness, but ancient darkness unsealed. Not strangers in the shadows, but the original rebels, teachers of forbidden knowledge re-entering the story when restraints weaken. In that frame, the end times become less about future monsters and more about ancient prisoners whose sentence reaches its final stage. The Watcher's prison is not merely a mythic curiosity, and it is a warning that God has already locked away powers so dangerous that the world could not be allowed to endure them freely. And if Scripture truly teaches a season when seals are broken and judgments are released, then the thought that should terrify the modern mind is simple. Some doors were closed for mercy. And mercy does not remain forever when the appointed day arrives. Long before the prophet spoke of beasts and trumpets, before the Apostle John saw seals break like cracks in the sky, the unseen realm already had a bureaucracy of judgment, messengers who did not negotiate, officers who did not hesitate, and holy agents assigned to restrain what humanity could not restrain. The Watchers did not fall into chaos by accident. They were sentenced, and in the oldest accounts, their sentencing is carried out by named beings, archangels who function not only as warriors, but as wardens. In the Enochic tradition, the cry of the earth rises to heaven like testimony in court, and God answers with orders. Raphael, Gabriel, Michael, and Uriel are dispatched with distinct assignments: binding, destruction of corrupted offspring, and the cleansing of the earth itself. 1 Enoch 9-10. This detail is critical for your story because it frames the prison as organized. There is procedure, there are roles, there is a chain of command. If there is a prison, there are wardens. Let chapter 3 end with the feeling of a courtroom door closing. Not triumph, not celebration, just the heavy certainty that the prison is real, the wardens are vigilant, and history is moving toward a day when that vigilance will no longer be focused on holding doors shut, but on opening them for final judgment, because in the end, even chains exist to serve a timeline, and every timeline in Scripture moves toward one unavoidable event, the day when every prisoner is brought out to stand before the throne. The flood did not end the Watcher's story. It ended their visible chapter. Water can erase cities, drown violence, and silence the scream of a corrupted age, but it cannot unwind what has already been taught into the human mind. That is the unsettling logic running beneath the ancient tradition. God removed the architects, yet the architecture remained, embedded in human appetite, encoded into memory, and preserved in the shadow life of spirits that were born from the rebellion. Genesis describes the world before the flood as filled with corruption and violence, and God's response as total judgment upon all flesh outside the ark, Genesis 6-7. But after the waters recede, the human heart is still described as bent toward evil, and the earth must be governed by covenant restraint rather than naive innocence. Genesis 8:21, Genesis 9. This alone should change how the audience hears the Watcher's prison. The chains were not meant to create a perfect world. They were meant to stop a specific kind of catastrophe from repeating on the same scale. In the Enochic framework, the most haunting consequence is not the giants themselves, but what remains after them. The text claims that when the giant offspring are destroyed, their spirits do not share the ordinary fate of human souls, and they become evil spirits that remain upon the earth, causing oppression, attack, and deception permitted to continue until the final judgment. 1 Enoch 15-16. Whether a listener receives that literally, symbolically, or as theological imagination, the narrative function is clear. The Watcher's imprisonment does not remove spiritual conflict, it transforms it. The Watchers are contained, but the aftermath still prowls. The teachers are silenced, but the curriculum has already spread. The prison is a lock placed on one door, not a cancellation of the entire war. This helps explain why post-flood humanity quickly returns to patterns that feel eerily pre-flood: pride, domination, idolatry, occult hunger. The Bible does not describe the nations as morally neutral tribes that slowly discover evil. Instead, it shows evil as an invasive constant that reasserts itself with speed. By the time you reach Babel, humanity is already attempting a unified project that reads like a counterfeit ascent, reaching heaven by technology, name-making, and defiant unity, Genesis 11. That is the same impulse the Watchers exploited, the desire to rise without God, to transcend limits without holiness. So even with the Watchers chained, the human heart still echoes their rebellion. The prison prevented one kind of corruption, hybrid transgression and open angelic governance, but it did not remove the human appetite to be ruled by something other than God. Ancient writings beyond Enoch intensify this picture by describing a measured spiritual economy after the flood. Jubilees portrays malignant spirits afflicting humanity and even depicts a plea for mercy, resulting in a portion being restrained while a portion remains to test and to expose hearts, Jubilees 10. Again, the theme is boundaries, permissions, limits, God governing evil rather than pretending it doesn't exist. That is critical for your tone. The unseen realm is not a wild forest, it is a controlled theater. Some doors are locked, some are allowed to remain open just enough for choice to be real and for judgment to be just. Now the Gospels enter like a spotlight that confirms the prison system without explaining it. When Jesus meets the possessed man in the country of the Gerasenes, the spirits do not speak like myths. They speak like criminals aware of law. They beg him not to command them into the abyss. Luke 8:31. That single sentence is a bridge between the ancient prison tradition and the ministry of Christ. Then it implies the abyss is known among spirits as a place of confinement. It implies a hierarchy of punishment, and it implies that Jesus has the authority to send them there. The spirits aren't asking if the abyss exists, they are pleading for an exception. The judge has arrived early in their eyes, and they fear an immediate sentencing. Matthew's account adds another piece of the courtroom atmosphere. The demons cry out, "Have you come to torment us before the time?" Matthew 8:29. Not only does this confirm a place of torment, it confirms a schedule, a time that even unclean spirits recognize as appointed. That fits perfectly with Jude's language that rebellious angels are kept in chains until the judgment of the great day, Jude 6, and Peter's claim that God confined sinning angels to a deepest imprisonment, holding them until judgment, 2 Peter 2:4. The Gospels do not contradict the prison worldview. They illuminate it through fear. The unseen realm behaves as if heaven's legal structure is real. So in chapter 4, the atmosphere becomes about residue, a world washed clean on the surface but still haunted in the depths. That is where you lean into the idea of echoes, not as ghosts, but as consequences. Humanity after the flood lives on reclaimed land, under a sky that has just witnessed judgment, yet the same patterns begin to re-emerge. The Torah will later forbid sorcery, divination, enchantments, and communication with spirits, as if these practices are already present and dangerously accessible, Deuteronomy 18:9-14. That prohibition makes sense if the post-flood world still contains spiritual predators, roaming spirits, deceptive forces, and lingering occult knowledge. The prison restrained the Watchers' open activity, but it did not erase mankind's ability to seek darkness. This is also why the Bible repeatedly warns Israel about the gods of the nations, not because idols are merely dumb statues, but because behind worship there can be real spiritual influence. The Psalms and prophetic writings treat idolatry as both human sin and spiritual entanglement. Paul later frames pagan sacrifice as involving demons rather than God, 1 Corinthians 10:20. This is the same ecosystem, lesser spirits still active, still feeding on worship, still seducing cultures. If the Watchers are chained, then what's left fills the vacuum, powers that work through deception rather than open dissent. The prison did not end the war. It changed the battlefield. The Dead Sea Scrolls add weight to this by preserving a worldview where cosmic conflict is organized, with the sons of light contending against the spirits of darkness in a disciplined theology of warfare, War Scroll 1QM. Even if your story remains primarily biblical, this scroll world supports the mood. Ancient Jewish thought did not imagine evil as random. It imagined an ordered opposition under limits, opposed by angelic hosts under command. In that framework, the Watcher's imprisonment becomes one decisive operation in a longer campaign. Now bring in the most disturbing implication. If the prison is real, then the earth contains sealed compartments of history. Not every judgment is public. Not every containment is visible. Some of God's restraints operate beneath the narrative humans tell themselves. That means the post-flood world is living above a locked cellar. Men plant vineyards. They form tribes. They trade. They build altars. They forget. But beneath that ordinary life, beneath deserts, beneath mountains, beneath places that look harmless, there are sealed memories in the form of bound beings who cannot die, cannot forget, and cannot repent. They wait, and in waiting, they become a pressure, not because their chains loosen, but because time itself moves toward the hour when judgment becomes active again. This is where you connect the echoes to prophecy. Jude's sequence, rebellious angels chained, ancient world flooded, Sodom judged, reads like a pattern of escalating examples meant to warn the present, Jude 6-7. Peter's similar sequence functions the same way, and adding that God knows how to rescue the righteous while keeping the unrighteous under punishment until judgment, 2 Peter 2:4-9. These passages are not just historical footnotes, they are theological warnings that the past is predictive. God does not improvise judgment. He repeats his righteousness in recognizable forms. If he chained angels once, he can chain again. If he flooded once, he can cleanse again. If he judged cities once, he can judge nations again. So the echo after the flood becomes the shadow of the end. The world is not drifting aimlessly. It is moving along a track where certain things are restrained until their appointed revelation. Revelation will later show this restraint and release mechanism explicitly. Seals break in sequence, trumpets sound in sequence, bowls pour in sequence, and even chained beings are released at specific times, Revelation 6-9. That structure is the ultimate confirmation that the Watcher's prison is consistent with biblical apocalyptic logic. Judgment is timed, restraint is purposeful, release is permitted, not accidental. And now, place the audience inside the dread. The post-flood world feels safe because the worst has already happened. People assume the ancient horror is buried. But the biblical and scroll traditions insist that some horrors are not dead, only contained. The prison is still there. The chains still hold. The wardens still watch. Yet the Gospels show something even more unsettling. The moment Christ appears, the unseen realm begins reacting like prisoners hearing footsteps in a corridor. Spirits panic because his presence signals that the clock is moving toward sentencing. Note, he is not merely a teacher of ethics, he is the authority that confirms judgment is real. This is why the echoes matter. After the flood, humanity lives in the quiet between two storms, the storm that already cleansed the earth and the storm that will one day unseal what remains chained. The Watcher's story did not end with water. It continued as pressure under history, sealed, silent, and waiting, while the surface world rebuilt under the illusion that the deepest rebellion was merely a legend. But Scripture never treats it as legend. It treats it as precedent, and precedent means repeatability. The road to Helheim is not a fall. It's a leaving. That distinction changes everything. A fall suggests punishment. One wrong step, and you plummet. But the Old North often imagined death as travel, a departure from the circle of fires and voices into a distance that keeps widening until you cannot hear life anymore. So the journey down is not just geography. It's grief made into a road. The living stand at the edge of that road every time they lose someone. They can't walk it, but they can feel its pull. The way the house feels too empty, the way the air keeps moving even though one person has stopped moving, the way the world refuses to pause. Myth takes that feeling and builds it into images. A path, a gate, a river, a boundary that you cross once. And the most chilling part is that none of it is dramatic. It's ordinary, isn't like stepping out into winter and realizing the wind doesn't care who you are. In some tellings, Helheim lies beneath the roots of the world tree, deep where daylight doesn't reach. The world tree is imagined as holding everything, gods, humans, giants, beasts, and beneath it, at its base, is the realm where the dead settle. That is not accidental imagery. A tree's roots are where it draws sustenance. They are hidden. They are the part you don't look at unless you're digging. So the underworld beneath roots suggests something uncomfortable. The living world is fed by what is buried. Life and death are connected, not separated by moral walls, but by layers. To go to Helheim is to become part of that hidden layer. And again, the Norse didn't soften this. They didn't paint it as a reunion picnic. They painted it as distance. And that is why gates appear in the imagery. Because gates are human language for separation. You can still see the other side sometimes. You can still imagine it, but you can't cross freely anymore. A gate is a statement. You are now in a different order of existence, and death is exactly that. The journey is often described in terms of crossing. A river appears in many underworld traditions because rivers are natural boundaries. They cut land. They divide. They demand either a bridge or a boat or a gamble. When you cross a river, you are leaving one side behind. That's why a river belongs to the road to Helheim. It makes the irreversibility feel real. And then there's the part that feels like a blade between ribs. In the Norse imagination, the dead do not necessarily arrive instantly. There is travel time. There is a sense of long movement. The afterlife is not a light switch. It is a procession away. Why imagine it this way? Because that is how loss feels. A person doesn't vanish emotionally the moment they die. Their absence stretches out. The living keep reaching for them in the mind. The dead keep existing in memory. The relationship doesn't snap. It trails. So the myth says, the dead travel. They move farther and farther until that trailing thread finally goes taut and breaks. That break is the gate. That break is the river. That break is the moment you realize they are truly gone. Burial rituals become crucial in this framework because rituals are how humans manage departure. You don't just dispose of the body. You guide, you escort, you mark the transition so the dead do not hover too close, confused, hungry, bitter. You speak the name. You give items. You build a mound or light a pyre. You do things in order, not because the dead need gold to buy their way in, because the living need structure to survive the chaos, and because the dead need a road. In a world where boundaries matter, a dead person stuck between boundaries is dangerous. A restless dead is a problem not because it makes spooky noises, but because it means the world's structure is failing. The separation between living and dead is leaking. So the rituals are a kind of seal. Close the door. Mark the gate. Let the dead go. That's the impulse behind it. Now, what does the road feel like? The Norse imagination keeps returning to cold imagery because cold is what death feels like in the north. Not only physically, though a corpse cools quickly in winter, but spiritually, emotionally. Cold is the sensation of a world without human warmth. So the road down is pictured as bleak, frost-dusted, gray. Mist, distance, a kind of silence that presses on the ears. But not horror film silence. The Old North didn't need theatrical scare tactics. It had real silence. The kind you hear when snow has fallen and the entire landscape is muted, as if the world has been wrapped in wool. That silence isn't screaming. It's swallowing. That's Helheim's temperature. And the strangest part is that it isn't always framed as cruel. It's framed as what is. Helheim is the winter side of existence, and if you live in a world where winter can kill you, you learn not to moralize winter. Winter isn't evil. Winter is the rule that keeps reminding you life is fragile. Helheim is winter, eternalized, so the dead travel into winter. They travel into a world where the hearth is gone. Now, the road also implies something else. Companionship. If the dead travel, who walks with them? Sometimes the myths suggest guides, sometimes not. Sometimes the dead simply go as they are, pulled by the gravity of their new state. But even without named guides, the imagination of travel implies that death is not only a moment, it is a process, and processes can be slow. This is why some stories speak of the dead lingering near the living for a time, especially if the burial is delayed, or if the death was sudden, or if the person's relationships were tangled. It's not a clean spiritual doctrine, it's an intuitive psychological truth. Sudden deaths don't feel finished. They feel like unfinished sentences. So the myth creates room for that. The dead can be near, briefly, or until the road takes them fully. Then, beyond the gate, Helheim. And what is Helheim like once you pass in? It is often described as a realm of halls too, but not like Valhalla, not loud, not bright, not weapon racks and feasting. Helheim's halls are shadowed, cold, and wide. It is a place of staying rather than striving. Think of the difference like this. Valhalla is a camp. Helheim is a settlement. Valhalla is motion. Helheim is stillness. That stillness can be comforting if you are tired enough. But it can also be terrifying if your whole identity was built on motion and conquest and song. So Helheim becomes the ultimate challenge to a warrior culture. What are you when you are no longer fighting? What are you when your hands are empty? What are you when no one chants your name? That's why Helheim feels like a cold wind. Even to modern people, it forces you to confront what you are without your performance, and that is not an easy question. Now, because the Norse world loved boundaries, Helheim is not necessarily a single uniform space. Like a real landscape, it has zones. Some are gentler, some harsher. Some are simply quiet, some are described as bleak and grim. Later sources intensify certain punishments, especially for oathbreakers and the deeply dishonorable, reflecting moral categories that become more prominent later. But again, the key is scale. Helheim must be large enough for the ordinary dead. Ordinary dead are not all criminals, so the realm cannot be defined solely by punishment, it is defined by separation. Separation is the common denominator of death. You are separated from your farm, from your family, from your body's warmth, from the smell of bread, from the sound of your own footsteps. Even if some part of you continues, it continues in a world where life's textures are gone. That is why the myths emphasize distance and gates. They are ways of describing the severing of texture. And because humans fear being severed, humans create stories to hold on to the severing. Now, this chapter's truth is simple but heavy. Helheim isn't terrifying because it tortures you. It's terrifying because it ends the part of you that thought you could keep going forever in some recognizable form. It is the end of your involvement with the living world, and no amount of courage changes that. Courage can change how you face it, but not that it comes. That is the Norse truth beneath all heroic talk. The universe is not impressed by bravery, but bravery is still required. It is because the universe is cold. So the road to Helheim is the ultimate test of northern virtue, not because it asks you to fight, but because it asks you to accept that your story will end, to accept that most stories end quietly, to accept that the world will keep moving. And if you can accept that without collapsing, then you have achieved something deeper than Valhalla's myth. You have achieved dignity in the face of reality. But there's another layer to the road down, and it's the layer that will sting modern viewers the most. Helheim is not only a destination, it is a mirror that exposes why Valhalla became so popular in the first place. Because Valhalla isn't just a belief, it's a psychological weapon against the fear of being forgotten. And once Christianity arrives, once conversion starts rewriting the map, Helheim becomes the perfect canvas for fear. The quiet realm gets painted as a moral threat, the default destination becomes an insult, the natural end becomes punishment. So in the next chapter, we have to confront the trap directly, the way Helheim gets mistaken for hell, the way the conversion era reshapes old beliefs, and the way the Norse afterlife map gets rewritten into something it never originally was. Because the biggest misunderstanding in the modern world is not Valhalla. It's hell. And once you see what happened to Helheim under the Christian shadow, you'll understand why the quiet truth stayed buried for so long. The easiest way to destroy an old belief is not to forbid it, it's to rename it. That's what happened to Helheim. Because once the North began to convert, slowly, unevenly, village by village, new words arrived that carried new emotional gravity. Priests didn't only preach a different God, they brought a different architecture of fear, sin, judgment, eternal punishment, salvation, damnation. And when those ideas met an older Norse underworld called Hell, the collision created one of history's most persistent misunderstandings. Helheim became hell in the modern imagination. But that translation is not a clean equivalence, it's a recoloring. It's taking a realm of cold inevitability and painting it with moral fire. To understand the original Norse map, you have to separate these layers like scraping soot off a wall. Because in the older Norse worldview, Helheim is not primarily a moral courtroom, it is primarily a demographic reality. Most people do not die in battle, most people do not drown on a ship, most people do not die in grand saga moments, so most people must go to the realm that receives ordinary death. That realm is Helheim. If you turn Helheim into the place of the wicked, you collapse the entire system into nonsense. You end up condemning the majority of your own society for the crime of dying normally. The farmer who died of sickness is not wicked. The mother who died in childbirth is not damned. The child taken by fever is not evil. So Helheim cannot be the Norse equivalent of later Christian hell because the Norse afterlife system is not built to function as a universal moral scoring mechanism. Yes, the Norse had moral concepts: honor, shame, oaths, reputation, betrayal. But those concepts were not primarily tied to an eternal divine court the way later Christian doctrine frames it. They were tied to social consequences here and now: vengeance, legal assemblies, feud, inheritance, exile, protection. Morality was communal and practical, not cosmic and absolutist. So when Christianity arrives and begins demanding cosmic judgment, good people go here, bad people go there. It needs a place in the Norse map to attach that idea. Helheim is an obvious target because the name sounds close enough and because it's already down. Down becomes bad. Cold becomes punishment. Distance becomes damnation. And hell, who is a boundary figure, becomes a devil-like figure because the new theology needs its antagonists. This is not just theological history. It's psychology. Humans don't like neutral endings. They want endings to mean something in a moral sense. They want the universe to agree with their values and punish what they hate. So the conversion-era imagination begins to moralize the underworld. But if you're trying to recover the older Norse truth, you must resist that pull. Helheim is not where you go because you failed morally. Helheim is where you go because you died. That's why it's frightening. Not because it's a torture chamber, because it is the most honest fate. Now, to be fair, there are darker underworld images in Norse sources, especially in later writings, where certain kinds of people are described as suffering. Oathbreakers, murderers, those who violated sacred bonds. Those images exist and they matter, but they are not the foundation of the system. They are the edges. The foundation is still the ordinary dead. And the edges become exaggerated under Christian influence, because Christian writers, even when preserving Norse poems, often did so through their own moral lens. They weren't neutral recorders. They were cultural translators, and translators always bring their own worldview into the room. So even when a text is Norse, you have to ask, which century, which audience, which pressure? Because by the time many of the surviving Norse texts were written down, the North was already living under the shadow of Christian thought. The old religion was no longer the dominant one. It was being remembered, recorded, sometimes mocked, sometimes romanticized, sometimes reframed as old stories rather than living truth. That shift matters because it changes emphasis. A living religion doesn't need to explain itself like a museum label. It simply is. A remembered religion gets reorganized, edited, made coherent, moralized, simplified. That is what happens to Helheim. It goes from the broad realm of the ordinary dead to the place you threaten people with. And once that happens, Valhalla becomes even more inflated by contrast. If Helheim is framed as punishment, then Valhalla becomes heaven, and the whole complex map collapses into a two-option system: good versus bad, heaven versus hell. But that two-option system is not Norse. It is imported. The older Norse system is not a fork in the road. It is a landscape with multiple claims, and the key variable is often how you die, not how morally pure you were. That's why drowning has a destination. That's why battle has a destination. That's why the mound has a destination. That's why Helheim exists as the default. So the Christian shadow does two things at once. It moralizes Helheim into hell. It glamorizes Valhalla into heaven. Both are distortions, and both distortions are deeply attractive to modern minds because modern minds prefer simple stories. But simplicity is not truth. Now, here's another cold layer. Christian conversion didn't happen overnight, and it didn't erase old beliefs instantly. For a long time, people lived in overlap. They were baptized and still made offerings, just in case. They named Christ and still spoke of old spirits. They attended church and still feared Moundead. They carried crosses and still remembered Odin. Religious change is messy, and that messiness creates hybrid imagery. Underworld becomes more judgmental. Gods become demons. The ancestor presence becomes pagan superstition. The old map gets redrawn in new ink. Helheim is one of the biggest casualties of that redraw because its name was too convenient. But if you look at the original emotional tone of Helheim, cold, distant, quiet, you realize it doesn't match the emotional tone of Christian hell. Hot, punitive, moralistic. They serve different functions. Christian hell is designed to enforce moral behavior through fear. Helheim is designed to explain mortality through realism. One is a threat, the other is an acknowledgement. That difference is everything. Because when you confuse them, you misunderstand what Viking Age people were actually facing. You start imagining them as obsessed with sin and eternal judgment, but many were obsessed with something else, survival and remembrance. They weren't trying to be saved from underworld punishment. They were trying to die with their name intact. They were trying to keep their family alive. They were trying to hold land through harsh seasons and harsher politics. Valhalla fits that obsession because it promises remembrance. Helheim fits their reality because it promises nothing beyond ending. And humans need both, a dream and a truth. The Norse had both. Conversion-era retellings tried to replace the truth with a threat. Now, this matters for your story because it reframes your whole theme. Most Vikings didn't go to Valhalla isn't only about Valhalla being selective. It's also about how later cultures reprogrammed the emotional meaning of where most people actually went. They turned the ordinary destination into a shame. They turned the quiet majority into a moral failure. And that is historically and psychologically revealing, because it shows how power uses the afterlife as a tool. If you can control people's fear of death, you can control their behavior. If you can convince them that ordinary death equals punishment, you can shepherd them toward whatever system promises escape. So Helheim becomes a rhetorical weapon, and Valhalla becomes a romantic fantasy. Both lose their original function. But in the older Norse map, Helheim is not shameful. It's normal. It's what happens when you live in a world where most deaths are unheroic. And that leads us to the next and most uncomfortable truth of all. Even Valhalla, glamorous, legendary Valhalla, is not a safe paradise. It is a hall built around doom. It is a recruitment camp for a war that ends in the gods themselves bleeding out. So if you've been treating Valhalla as the best outcome, the next chapter forces you to stare at the cost. Because the price of being chosen is not comfort, it's being used until the sky breaks. And once you understand that, Helheim stops looking like the worst ending. It starts looking like the only ending that doesn't demand you die twice. Valhalla looks like a reward only if you refuse to read it to the end. The hall shines in the songs, gold light, roaring laughter, endless meat, cups that never empty. It's the kind of image a cold people would build the way you build a bigger fire, to push back the fear for a few more hours. But in the oldest logic, Valhalla is not an ending, it's a holding pattern. A place where the dead are kept sharp because something worse than death is coming. That something is not vague. It isn't symbolic. It has teeth and names and prophecies. The wolves grow large enough to swallow the sun. The sea rises and breaks its restraints. The dead walk. The enemies the gods tried to contain finally spill out. And Odin, who knows this more clearly than anyone, does not gather the Einherjar so they can rest. He gathers them so they can be spent. That is the cost hidden under the feast. Every morning in Valhalla begins the same way. The dead arm themselves and go out to kill each other, not to settle grudges, not to win land, to train, to keep reflexes alive, to keep fear from making their hands clumsy when the real war arrives. They die, they rise, they die again, and you have to sit with what that means. If Valhalla is paradise, why is it built like a slaughterhouse? If Valhalla is heaven, why does it require blood every day? The answer is the same cold answer the North gives again and again, because the universe isn't designed for comfort, it's designed for struggle. Even the gods can't escape that design. So Valhalla is not safety, it is duty without release, and that changes the emotional weight of everything you thought you knew, because the modern fantasy is that Valhalla is where you finally stop suffering. In the older vision, Valhalla is where suffering becomes organized, weaponized, given a schedule. You are fed and healed not because you are loved, but because you must remain functional. That sounds harsh, because it is. Odin is not a god who gathers the dead the way a mother gathers children. He gathers them the way a commander gathers spears. And spears don't get to ask what the war is for. Now, here's the twist that makes Valhalla feel almost tragic. The Einherjar are being prepared for a battle that does not end in clean victory. Ragnarok is not an epic where the heroes win and the world returns to normal. It is a breaking, a burning, a drowning, a shattering. Odin himself is fated to die. Thor dies. Frey and other bright powers fall. The world is remade, yes, but not without cost so heavy it changes the meaning of the word meaning. So ask yourself, if you are one of Odin's chosen, what exactly are you being chosen for? To stand in the last war beneath a collapsing sky against enemies that do not tire. To die again. And not the friendly, reversible death of training fields. Real death. Final death. The kind that ends even gods. That's the promise at the end of Valhalla's song. You will be used until the end. So when modern people say, I want to go to Valhalla, they are unknowingly saying, I want to be drafted into the apocalypse. It sounds heroic when you don't think about it. It sounds different when you do. Because being chosen is not only honor, it is ownership. Valhalla turns you into a resource. Your bravery becomes fuel for Odin's plan to delay the inevitable by a few more breaths. And that raises a question the songs don't love to ask out loud. Does Odin choose you for your sake, or for his? The Old North doesn't answer politely. It shows Odin as brilliant and desperate, a god who does terrible things because he knows the end is real. A god who is not evil, but not gentle. A god who will sacrifice almost anything, but including other people, to push back the darkness one more step. Valhalla, then, is the physical shape of Odin's desperation. A bright hall built not on joy, but on fear. Fear that knowledge cannot stop fate, fear that power cannot stop fate, fear that even gods die. And that fear is not abstract. It bleeds into the psychology of the living too. Because if even Odin cannot escape the end, what chance do you have? This is why fame becomes so important in Norse culture. Not because they were shallow, but because they needed something that could outlive doom. If the world ends, at least your name might remain in the mouths of those who come after. If you cannot defeat death, at least you can defeat forgetting. That's the obsession under the obsession. So Valhalla becomes more than a hall. It becomes a symbol of being remembered. Of being counted. Of being pulled out of the anonymous crowd and placed into a story that survives longer than your bones. But here is where the cold wind returns. Valhalla does not guarantee that either. Because even if your name is sung, it will eventually be swallowed by time unless the living keep choosing to repeat it. Helheim threatens you with silence, but time threatens you with the same thing. The difference is that Helheim is honest about it. Valhalla distracts you from it with noise. This is why the modern myth is so irresistible. It offers a loophole. Be brave, die well, get rewarded, become immortal in a hall of endless celebration. The older myth offers something harsher. Be brave, die well, and you might be recruited into a war you cannot win. That is not a loophole. That is a trade. And once you see it as a trade, Helheim starts to look different. Not worse, just quieter. Not shameful, just final. Not punished, just ended. For some minds, that finality is terrifying. For others, it's mercy. Because endless combat, even with endless feasting, still means endless combat. It means never laying the burden down. It means your identity is frozen as warrior forever, even if you were tired of being one before you died. Valhalla is the afterlife where you never get to stop being useful. Helheim is the afterlife where usefulness ends. That contrast is uncomfortable because it forces you to question the most basic fantasy modern people carry, that the best afterlife is always the loudest, brightest, most active one. Sometimes the best ending is not a bigger stage. Sometimes the best ending is rest. Now, the Norse didn't frame Helheim as restful in a cozy way. It is cold, it is distant, it is quiet in a way that can feel like erasure. But Valhalla is not restful either. It is loud in a way that can feel like imprisonment. So the map of the dead becomes more complicated than good place and bad place. It becomes a set of trade-offs, and trade-offs are the most realistic thing a harsh culture can offer. This is why the question, most Vikings didn't go to Valhalla, is not an insult to Viking courage. It is a correction to a modern fantasy. It is a reminder that the Old North was not selling a self-help version of religion. It was describing a world where even the gods are trapped in a story with an ending. And if the gods are trapped, then the human mind begins to look for another kind of survival, one that doesn't depend on being chosen by Odin or claimed by Freya or stolen by the sea. That survival is memory, reputation, legacy, the one thing Helheim cannot fully erase if the living refuse to let it. So the next chapter has to go there, into the real engine of Norse honor, the fear that sits beneath boasting and the reason Valhalla became so famous even if most people never expected to reach it. Because the deepest Viking question wasn't, how do I get to Valhalla? It was, how do I keep my name from dying twice? The North didn't worship bravery because it was beautiful. It worshipped bravery because it was a defense against something worse than pain. Come, forget the axes and the longships for a moment and listen to the psychology underneath the myth. A person can endure almost anything, hunger, cold, blood, loss, if they believe it means something. But if the suffering is pointless, if the ending is silence, if your life collapses into nothing but an unmarked absence, that is where the mind begins to break. So the Viking Age obsession with honor wasn't vanity. It was survival strategy. Honor was how you fought the second death, the death after death, when your name is no longer spoken. And once you understand that, everything in the afterlife map snaps into focus. Valhalla isn't just an afterlife destination, it's a symbol for the thing everyone wanted, to be counted, to be selected out of the anonymous mass, to have your end framed as a story instead of a disappearance. Helheim, or on the other hand, represents the fear no one wanted to look at directly, that most lives end quietly, and most quiet endings fade. So when warriors boasted, when skalds sang, when families guarded reputation like a blade, they weren't just building culture. They were building a wall against oblivion, because in the North, nothing was guaranteed. Not crops, not peace, not safety, not even the gods. If Ragnarok is real, then even divinity is mortal in the long view. Even Odin can be swallowed. Even the sky can break. So where do you put your hope? Not in permanence, you put it in something portable, memory. A name that survives your bones. That is why reputation was treated like a second body. You fed it, defended it, armed it. An insult wasn't just rude, it was a threat to your survival beyond death. A broken oath wasn't just wrong, it was a fracture in the invisible structure that held society together, and fractures invite collapse. That's why feud existed. Not because people loved violence, but because the alternative was humiliation, and humiliation was social death, often worse than physical death. A person without honor was a person who could be hunted, cheated, dispossessed, ignored. So honor was armor in life, and it was also currency in death, not because Helheim had a ticket booth, but because the living were the true gatekeepers of the afterlife that mattered most, being remembered. You can die and still live in songs. You can die and still sit at tables through stories. You can die and still shape decisions generations later because your name is heavy enough to bend people. That is what the North was really chasing. Yes, and this is where the modern Valhalla myth becomes understandable, even if it's wrong as a universal belief. People didn't exaggerate Valhalla because they were ignorant. They exaggerated it because they needed it. A young man facing battle wants certainty. He wants a deal. If I die well, my ending will be glorious. If I bleed bravely, my death will turn into a door. Even if he knows deep down that the world doesn't guarantee anything, the story helps his legs move forward anyway. Valhalla is a psychological weapon against fear. Helheim is the truth fears built on. And when a culture lives on the edge of starvation and storm, psychological weapons matter. So here's the cold logic. Most people didn't go to Valhalla, but most people still needed Valhalla to exist as an idea, because the idea keeps you standing. It's the same reason sailors make offerings to the sea even when they know offerings don't control weather. The act itself is a kind of courage, a refusal to be helpless. Valhalla gives you something to aim at. Even if you don't reach it, aiming changes how you live. But this aiming has a shadow, and the shadow is cruel. If your culture tells you only the loud deaths matter, then the quiet dead become invisible. The old, the sick, the mothers, the children, the farmers, those who keep the entire society alive, get treated as if their endings are lesser. Yet the North could not actually afford to believe that, not in reality, not in practice, because the North was held up by ordinary lives. So how did the culture balance this? By making honor bigger than battle. Honor lived in the way you kept your household from collapsing, in the way you provided through winter, in the way you repaid generosity, in the way you did not betray your kin, in the way you met misfortune without begging the world to be softer. Battle was one stage for honor, but not the only one. This is why the mound matters. This is why ancestors matter. This is why inheritance laws mattered. This is why oaths mattered. Because the greatest fear wasn't dying. It was dying and leaving nothing that holds. And if you look closely, you can see the tension everywhere in the afterlife map. Valhalla promises remembrance, but demands endless usefulness. Helheim promises ending, but threatens fading. The mound promises closeness, but can become a chain. The sea promises nothing except taking. So where does a person place their hope? In the only realm they can still influence, the living world. And that's why people chased stories. That's why they cared how their death would be spoken of. That's why they feared cowardice, not only because it was dangerous, but because it made your name fragile. A coward's death isn't just a death, it's a stain that can cling to your children. And in a world where your children need alliances to survive, a stain is lethal. So courage wasn't only personal virtue, it was family insurance. This is also why the conversion-era moral system hit the North so powerfully. Christianity offered a new kind of immortality, one not dependent on human memory. It offered cosmic judgment and eternal outcome. It promised that even the forgotten peasant mattered in the eyes of a universal God. That promise is incredibly attractive to anyone living in a world where glory is rare. And it also explains why Helheim was so easy to weaponize in later retellings. If you want people to accept a new system, you take their old default destination and you paint it as shame. You take Helheim and you turn it into hell. You take Valhalla and you turn it into a pagan imitation of heaven. You simplify the whole map into obedience. But the older Norse truth is rougher and in some ways more honest. The universe does not guarantee justice, so humans build meaning through bonds, oaths, and remembrance. That's the core. And once you see that core, you can finally understand why the quiet truth of Helheim feels like a cold wind even today. Because it collides with a modern obsession that looks a lot like the old one. The obsession with being seen, being remembered, going viral, leaving a mark. The fear of fading hasn't vanished. It just wears different clothes. So the North's old question becomes our question too. If you're not chosen, if you're not legendary, if your ending is quiet, what remains? The Norse answer wasn't despair. It was, live in a way that your absence still has weight. And now, with that understood, we're ready for the conversion pressure that reshaped everything. How the old map was recorded, edited, and sometimes distorted. How the sagas and poems we rely on were written down under new faith. How Helheim darkened and Valhalla turned into pop culture. Because to understand what Vikings believed, you have to understand not only the myths, but the hands that preserved them. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of what we know about the Viking afterlife comes to us through pens that no longer believed in it. The North didn't preserve its old religion in a sealed vault. It preserved it in a moment of transition, when kings were converting, when churches were rising, when old rituals were being tolerated in one valley and condemned in the next. That means the surviving record isn't pure. It's layered. And if you don't understand those layers, you'll misunderstand Helheim and Valhalla every time. Because the myth didn't only change in people's mouths, it changed in the act of being written down. For centuries, the Norse world was primarily oral. Stories lived in memory, in performance, in the rhythm of a voice in a smoky hall. Oral culture doesn't freeze stories, it adapts them. It keeps what matters, reshapes what doesn't, emphasizes what the moment needs. Then, as Christianity spread, writing spread with it. Literacy became tied to church structures, to monasteries, to law codes and Christian kingship. When the old myths were finally written down in the form we can read today, the people recording them were often Christian, or at least living in a Christian society. That fact matters because a recorder is never neutral. Even if they love the old stories, even if they want to preserve them, they are preserving them through a different worldview. They are deciding what is important, what is acceptable, what is poetic, and what is dangerous. So what happens to an underworld like Helheim under Christian eyes? It becomes easier to portray as punishment. What happens to a hall like Valhalla? It becomes easier to romanticize as a pagan heaven. The complex landscape gets pulled toward a simple moral geometry. Up equals good, down equals bad. That geometry is not originally Norse, it's imported. But the record is a mixture, so the mixture becomes what people inherit. This is why later generations, especially modern pop culture, end up with a cartoon version of Viking belief. They inherit the simplified shapes without the original emotional logic. Now think about the political pressure of conversion. Kings were not converting only for spiritual reasons. Conversion offered international alliances, trade advantages, legitimacy in the broader European Christian world. Baptism became politics. Churches became power structures. Old rituals became suspect because they represented loyalty to older authority. In that environment, old gods could be tolerated as stories, but not as truth. So the myths were increasingly framed as literature, not religion. That shift changes tone. It encourages moral commentary. It encourages the subtle undermining of old gods, turning them into flawed characters rather than sacred powers. And it encourages the absorption of old images into Christian moral categories. Hell becomes easier to demonize. Loki becomes easier to cast as a devil figure. The underworld becomes easier to present as a place of judgment, not because the recorders were necessarily malicious, but because they were swimming in a worldview where cosmic judgment is central. They naturally interpret underworld imagery through that lens. So even when they preserve Helheim, the coloring can shift. This is how you end up with later descriptions where certain underworld zones feel more like punishment realms, especially for oathbreakers and the dishonorable, because Christianity intensifies the moralization of the afterlife. Again, the Norse had moral categories, but they weren't centralized into a single eternal court in the same way. Conversion pushes the myths toward that structure. That push is the Christian shadow. Now, here's another layer. Preservation often happens through elite culture. Skalds, lawmen, scribes, historians. These are not random peasants. These are people closer to courts, closer to political centers, closer to the machinery of kingship and church. Elite culture has its own biases. Valhalla is elite-friendly. It glorifies warrior aristocracy. It fits the worldview of men who profit from war and loyalty. On the mound and the ordinary dead. Helheim, sickness deaths, women's deaths, children's deaths. Those are less glamorous. They matter immensely to real life, but they produce fewer heroic narratives. So even without Christian influence, the written record tends to preserve what elites enjoy: poems of kings, battles, gods, and cosmic drama. That means the Valhalla portion of the myth gets disproportionate spotlight. It's dramatic, it's memorable, it's marketable. Even in its own time, it was the kind of myth that traveled far because it energized warriors and honored chieftains. Helheim, being quiet and ordinary, naturally gets less poetic focus. So the record is skewed in two directions at once. Christian moral lens pushes Helheim darker and Valhalla heavenish. Elite narrative taste pushes Valhalla bigger and Helheim smaller. Put those together and you get the modern misconception. Vikings believed everyone went to Valhalla. That misconception isn't born from one lie. It's born from two pressures compressing complexity into a single icon. Now, the fascinating thing is that the older truth still leaks through. Even in Christian-era writings, you still see the plural afterlife map. Freya receiving slain, the sea claiming dead, mounds holding presence, Helheim as the broad destination. The complexity is still there. It's just buried under emphasis, which is exactly the theme of your entire story. The quiet truth is present, but the loud myth dominates. So when you tell this story, you're not just correcting a fun fact about Vikings. You're revealing how cultures rewrite the past to fit the emotional needs of the present. Christian Europe needed to frame pagan underworlds as morally inferior. Pop culture needed a single Viking heaven symbol. Modern audiences needed a simple story to repeat. So Valhalla won the meme war. Helheim lost. But the dead didn't change just because stories got simplified. People still died of fever, still died of age, still drowned, still fell from cliffs, still died in childbirth, still died without glory. So Helheim remained the true majority destination, whether or not the poster versions admitted it. And that is the coldest irony. A culture obsessed with fame built its loudest myth around the exception, while its actual daily reality flowed quietly into the underworld. Now we reach the end of the map, the part where all the threads tie together and the story stops being about Vikings and becomes about us. Because once you accept that most people don't get cinematic endings, the question becomes universal. If your end is quiet, does your life matter less? The Norse answer is not the one modern people expect, and it's the reason your final chapter needs to land like a closing door in winter. Because the quiet truth isn't meant to depress you. It's meant to strip away the fantasy that only glory makes a life worth something. Helheim is the realm that says most lives are ordinary, and ordinary lives still belong to the world's story. So in the final chapter, we're going to bring it all home. Valhalla as selective draft, Freya's share, the sea's theft, the mound's closeness, Helheim's inevitability, and deliver the last line the Old North would understand. The bravest thing isn't earning a heroic afterlife. It's living fully even when you know the wind will erase your footprints. If you strip away the Hollywood glow, the Viking afterlife isn't a reward system. It's a confession. A confession about what life is really like when winter is stronger than your plans, when disease doesn't care about honor, when the sea can erase a whole crew in a single hour, and when even the gods are fated to bleed out beneath a broken sky. That's why the map has so many doors, because one door would be a lie. Valhalla exists, but it was never meant for Vikings as a whole. It was Odin's draft board, a war hall built for a war that couldn't be avoided, a place where the chosen dead don't rest, they train, because Odin is terrified of Ragnarok and cannot stop preparing for it. Folkvanger exists too, Freya's field, proof that even the heroic dead were divided. Claimed, contested, even glory wasn't owned by one god. The sea has its own claim, Rand's net, because the North knew that water takes more lives than swords. Drowning isn't cowardice, it's physics, it's weather, it's the world reminding you you're small. The mound is another door, because many dead didn't go away in the imagination. They stayed near. They remained part of land, lineage, boundary stones, household luck. The dead were not only gone, they were still present in the structures that held life together. And Helheim, quiet Helheim, was the wide destination that held the majority. Not because the majority were shameful, not because they were condemned, because they died the way humans usually die. Old age, illness, accident, hunger, cold, the ordinary deaths that happen when life is real. That's the entire truth in one sentence. Valhalla was the exception. Helheim was the rule. And if that truth feels like a cold wind, it's because it collides with something inside us that still wants the same thing the Norse wanted, to believe our ending will be special. We don't admit it, but we carry the old hunger in new forms. We want to be seen. We want to matter. We want to leave something behind that doesn't vanish. We want the universe to notice us. Valhalla is the fantasy that the universe notices. Helheim is the reminder that the universe is not built to flatter you. So what do you do with that? What did the Norse do with it? They didn't collapse into despair. They didn't curl up and beg the world to be kinder. They did something harder. They built meaning anyway. They built it through oaths that mattered. Through names defended like iron, through loyalty to kin, through endurance when the world offered no applause, through work that kept children alive, through courage that wasn't always loud, through the stubborn refusal to become small even when they knew they were. Because here's the paradox the Old North understood. If the universe doesn't guarantee meaning, then meaning becomes something you forge, not something you're handed. Valhalla is the dream of being chosen, but the deeper Norse virtue was facing the truth without being broken by it. And Helheim, quiet, cold, ordinary Helheim, was the truth. Not to shame you, to sober you, to remind you that most people don't die in a saga, and yet most lives still hold weight. This is why the quiet truth matters. It rescues the majority from invisibility. It says the farmer's life matters. The mother's life matters. The child's short life matters. The old person's quiet death matters. The sailor lost to the sea matters, not because Odin drafted them, because they lived. And living in a harsh world is its own kind of bravery. So the final image of this story is not a golden hall. It's a door in the winter, a low door, a simple door. No cheering crowd behind it, no banners, no shining weapons, just the wind. And the truth that most humans share, your footprints will disappear. But you can still walk like your steps matter. Because the real Norse victory wasn't escaping Helheim. It was refusing to be nothing while you were still alive. And that is the quiet truth of Helheim. Cold, honest, and strangely human. Most Vikings didn't go to Valhalla, but most Vikings still faced the end with their heads up.